Hello and welcome to the Broadcast Newswrap, your shorthand guide to the week's TV news stories brought to you by our editorial team and some of the biggest brains in the business. I'm senior reporter Max Goldbart, and in case you hadn't noticed, it's US election week this week. But how on earth does one go about covering the tumultuous administration of a man who regularly labels some parts of the TV news media as the enemy? To answer all my burning questions and cut through the fake news is Robert Moore, ITV News Washington correspondent, who himself is in the midst of covering his fifth US election. Robert has the skinny on 4 years of covering the former Apprentice star, plus he tells us what he's been watching on this week's Broadcast Newswrap. So I'm simply delighted to welcome ITV News Washington correspondent Robert Moore. We're recording on Thursday, 5th of November, the afternoon, with Joe Biden currently ahead of Donald Trump by around 50 electoral college votes, according to some parts of the media. Although there is a bit of a way to go, and it sounds as if Donald Trump is not going to go lightly. But what we're really here to do is drill down into the experience of covering such a topsy-turvy election and administration for a major broadcaster. Robert, welcome.
Well, Max, thanks for having us. Always great to talk television news and politics, and indeed the intersection of the two.
Exactly. So how have your last 48 hours been, and have you slept at all, most importantly?
Well, we always say in this business that sleeping is for after the election is over and after the conclusion has been drawn. So no, we haven't had a lot of sleep. But it's been an exhilarating kind of journalistic experience. I've covered a few campaigns. I often joke that it's not my first rodeo here, but this has been really quite unlike any other, and we can talk more about that. But it's been exhilarating. This is why we're in Washington. This is the kind of, as we've talked about, this is kind of the intersection of politics, of television news. It's been a thrill to have kind of reinforcements sent in from London and to work with some of the most talented kind of engineers and cameramen that we have, all flown in from London, often deployed in the field. We've got teams, in out west, in Arizona. We've got teams in the Midwest. We've got Julie Etchingham in Florida. So we've got a wide range of teams. We've got Raggy Omar with Donald Trump. We've got Emma, our new incoming Washington correspondent with Joe Biden. And myself kind of, doing the overview here in DC, and it's worked really well for ITV News, and we've enjoyed every moment of it.
Great. Is there a bigger team than maybe you've had in the past? It sounds like you said, there's a lot of reinforcement.
Yeah, to be fair to ITV News, we often do invest in big events. We take pride in doing them. And so I think this is kind of the normal scale. But I think there is also kind of, by my editors in London, a recognition that this is also kind of a massive story just because of the scale and the kind of erratic nature of the Trump presidency. So we have invested, I think, on balance, kind of more resources than we normally would. We've got a presentation team. Obviously, Tom Bradby is here doing news at 10, but also we did a 7-hour live overnight broadcast on ITV News, which is a big investment for ITV. And so they believe in this story. And it was I felt kind of increased pressure as a kind of TV correspondent here to try and make sure that that investment was kind of matched by really high quality journalism every day on every program, but particularly on that overnight program when the stakes are so high and when we're really kind of trying to inform Brits minute by minute, state by state, what is happening and who is likely to be the next president of the United States.
And what do you during the last 48 hours, what have you been doing while you're not on air? How has that sort of shaped up for you?
Well, so we navigated it this way. I've been on the campaign trail with Donald Trump essentially, it feels like for 4 years, but actually, essentially since the summer, I've been traveling with the president, strategically, whenever he goes somewhere interesting, I tend to be there too. So I've been up in the battleground state of Wisconsin with him when he was holding events up in Green Bay. Recently, I was down in Central Florida, so we travel with the president reporting on the campaign. And then about 48 hours before the election, I pulled off the Donald Trump campaign and took on a more kind of strategic reporting role here in Washington and really was able to do an overview of the race. So I'm either reporting or doing live broadcasting on our roof over Capitol Hill in Washington, or I'm, as all journalists are in this town, we are massive consumers of news as well. We are grazing off every political blog you've ever read, some that you've never heard of, trying to understand the nuances of the campaign, but also of the actual kind of how this election might play out. So we're also ringing our friends and contacts in both the Democratic and Republican Party. So we're either broadcasting or we're in this kind of voracious kind of feeding mode when we're trying to gather as much information as we can so that we can kind of process that, curate it, and then broadcast it in a meaningful way for a British audience.
Yeah, it sounds like a daunting task.
I mean, I think the defining feature of, this, Max, but everybody knows it. It's just the amount of information now out there. Before, we would talk to our contacts, we'd try and get firsthand information from those in the administration or from those running rival campaigns. And, many of us have got quite deep contacts on both sides of the aisle. But we'd also then kind of read the New York Times, Washington Post, dip into a couple of broadcast networks, and that would be it. But now it doesn't work like that. There is quite a tsunami of information out there. There's a tremendous amount of kind of activist blogs. There is, a tremendous amount of congressional information. There's such a volume of, and not to mention sort of Twitter and things like that kind of dominate our lives. So for us, I think, and for me, certainly, the kind of the main challenge is just trying to absorb information at a kind of incredible level and not get overwhelmed by it, but actually trying to curate it and work out what is the most important thing. And the most important thing may not be the headline in the New York Times. The most important thing may be a single black activist somewhere in Alabama making an observation that is really cutting to the chase of what it's like being a kind of a young African-American voter in this environment, in this election, in a Republican state. Even as we look at this volume of information, it's trying to remember that this actually is about ordinary people casting a vote and their hopes and aspirations. So we're trying not to get overwhelmed by the information.
And it's interesting you talk about sort of absorbing and passing on information. I wanted to ask about the US election is sort of notoriously complicated, and the Electoral College can often be quite hard for one to get their head around. What kind of level of knowledge do you assume the UK viewer has about US politics, and how do you kind of translate?
Good question, Max. I mean, I think we try and assume not a lot of knowledge, but a great deal of interest. I think we kind of come to this, particularly in the Trump presidency, that there's fascination with the United States and with the character of Donald Trump. And probably we acknowledge that everybody understands that what happens here matters elsewhere too. I think that's a kind of a given, that the decisions made in the White House, ripple out across the world, whether it's, Middle Eastern wars or their economy or trade or whatever it might be. We think that, but I don't think we take for granted, or at least we try not to, a sort of, advanced political knowledge of the Electoral College system, or indeed knowledge even of, where particular states are. I mean, whenever we talk, for example, and we have been in the last 24 hours talking a lot about Arizona, I often wonder if, I'm not being patronizing here, but obviously not everybody knows the geography of the United States terribly well. Do people know where Arizona is? So I try and, put a clue in there, out west in Arizona, or, because, we are broadcasters. So sure, we're talking to people who are, follow American politics, very closely, but also to those who may not be, and they've got busy lives and this may not be their priority, and they're tuning into ITV News. And all of us at ITV are, very aware that our heritage is about being accessible, assuming not a lot, but trying to make sure that the news that we broadcast reaches, right across the UK to all types of audience, to all demographics, as they say here. And so we're trying not to take a lot for granted, but to try and draw people in and make them part of the kind of the ITV family.
I was watching a bit of CNN on Tuesday night, and since then I've seen maybe little bits of criticism around the US reporting of the election, in the sense of it being quite sensationalist and declaring counts very early and sort of sowing confusion almost. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll tell you what I think the defining feature of kind of US journalism is partisanship. It's really remarkable to which the networks now have, at least some of the kind of news channels have become kind of very shrill and are manifestly, kind of advocates for a particular candidate. It goes without saying the kind of deep and if somewhat complicated, but deep relationship between Fox News and the White House. But, it's also clear that, MSNBC and their commentary is clearly invested in a Joe Biden presidency, and CNN and obviously have a, pretty confrontational relationship with this White House as well. So I think the defining kind of relationship between the American networks and the White House is just how kind of partisan and adversarial it has become. And that obviously is completely different in the kind of British media landscape, where, we take great pride in almost exactly the opposite, in making sure that we give the viewer the credit to draw their own conclusions, and we're much more neutral. Now, I'm not naive that, people will say that we are establishment and therefore don't absorb enough kind of information from alternative viewpoints or alternative news sources, and that's a criticism, that we can talk about on another day. But overall, we're certainly not in the tank for Donald Trump or for Joe Biden, and we are just trying to present the kind of unfolding political drama as it happens.
And it sounds like you're working on sort of boosting the alternative news sources that you keep your eyes on.
What I'm working really hard on, and what I've spent some years trying to do here, is make sure that we're listening to voices that are not otherwise heard. We really pride ourselves in the bureau that I run here in making sure we're not kind of stuck in the Washington Beltway of just listening to kind of politicians on the Hill or at the White House. But we were actually, by far the most interesting voices I've heard on the campaign trail are voices, out in the Midwest or in the Deep South here. And sometimes they're just somebody I meet on a corner or meet at a diner here. And they give me a powerful insight into why voting is important or why they're disillusioned with a candidate. And it can be very surprising. We can hear voices from Black Americans, why they love Trump. We can hear from left-wing progressive activists why they despise Joe Biden as a centrist and somebody who signed the crime bill and all of this stuff. So it doesn't fit into neat categories. And the real benefit of doing that act is that you get to hear and realize what a diverse country this is. And therefore, how reporting it is frankly almost impossible, because there is no narrative. There are 330 million Americans, often with a completely different set of views. It teaches you not to generalize, in essence.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking in contrasting the US situation with the UK. There's just, we have such a smaller population that it's sort of easier to box people almost into groups.
We always joke in the field about, the anchor, the presenter back in London saying, well, Robert, what does America feel about this? Q reporter, actually there's 330 million Americans, and they probably different things. So we often tease our kind of presenter friends back in London for throwing us in live two ways questions that are, manifestly impossible to answer in 20 seconds or however long I get on News at 10.
You were just telling me you've been covering elections on and off since 2000. Just how different has covering this Trump administration been compared with previous administrations?
Oh, I mean, it's been wildly different. And, if we're honest, quite exciting, because he draws us into the narrative. If you go to a Trump rally, at some point, probably about 11 or 12 minutes in, because these things are unbelievably choreographed and unbelievably repetitive, about 11 minutes in, he'll point to us and say fake news, and the crowd will boo us and taunt us and make clear that they regard us as the enemy. So there is this wonderfully kind of provocative and actually quite engaging relationship between a Trump crowd and the media. And although, it can get a little hostile, the actual takeaway is that Trump is using us as a kind of foil, and that he doesn't really hate us. In fact, he needs us and actually loves, the secret story of the Trump presidency is he loves us. But he's using us to kind of, rile his base and to make political points about a fake news narrative. And so that is absolutely unique to the last 4 years. And so that's challenging to cover because, people are suspicious of a kind of what he would call a mainstream media narrative. But for us, we just have to keep our focus, on the ball, which is to say that, just report all aspects of America as it plays out, including, of course, the very powerful, very articulate and very real feelings of a Trump campaign crowd.
It sounds like for the most part you've enjoyed covering the administration, but have you felt almost threatened at times, or like that Donald Trump media hostility was making you nervous or preventing you?
No, I personally haven't. I know there was a kind of an ugly incident with a BBC cameraman. I think that
Mm.
about a year ago, where there was, genuinely some intimidation. Maybe there was even a scuffle. But actually, my experience is not that. My experience is it is almost entirely theatrical, and that you actually meet a Trump supporter who's moments ago was jeering you. You look them in the eyes, and they'll give you a hug. Underlying all of this kind of theater, this political drama, is a basic American decency, civility, and friendship. It's all just pretty good natured in my experience. And to say I've enjoyed it is an understatement. I've loved this campaign. The issues it raises are very real. Obviously it's been unique as well. From a news gathering point of view, we can talk a bit about this too, in terms of working in a pandemic, particularly in a country where there's a surging virus, both the first wave when the primaries were finishing and the second wave during this kind of final part of the presidential campaign. That has been challenging because we've been traveling on planes, in hotels, on the road, by definition mixing with Trump crowds that are sometimes tens of thousands strong, and trying to make sure that we're also cognizant of the public health aspect of that.
Yeah, it must have made things quite difficult over the past few months. Sort of adds a layer of complexity.
Particularly difficult because, of course, Trump and, he had COVID and his White House events were regarded as kind of super spreader events in which, the virus was kind of ricocheting around the White House itself. So how do we get to the White House and report on it without getting coronavirus ourselves, or indeed, being asymptomatic, bringing it back to our families, or indeed to our, colleagues in the Bureau, is all quite a complicated picture. And, we were careful to wear masks where we could because we still thought it was socially responsible. But, where we had a 6-foot distance from people, I would take it off to broadcast because, dare I say it, it's not always easy seeing a television reporter with a mask and not quite hearing his voice very clearly. My mother's hard of hearing. She would say to me, Robert, I couldn't hear what you said because I need to see your lips moving or whatever to help me lip read. There's so many issues in live broadcasting in a Trump era America amid a pandemic. I mean, that is a kind of a cascade of events that makes live television news very demanding, very challenging.
Have you had much face-to-face time with Trump over the last few years? What do you think of him kind of personally?
Yeah, so look, I go to his press conferences from time to time. I've obviously seen him on the campaign trail, almost daily for the last couple of months. And, I've thrown him a few questions throughout his presidency, some of which he's answered, some of which he hasn't. My kind of abiding thought is that much of this is theatre for him. We see kind of animosity and toxicity, if you like, in the Trump presidency. But as a character, he's kind of craving attention above all else. This is narcissism. I'll leave it to sort of psychiatrists and therapists to analyze his character in full from an emotional point of view. But look, I think it's fair to say, Max, that he has been the gift that keeps on giving for television news. The reason I've been broadcasting almost every day for 4 years, is not because of a sudden fascination with, the economic performance of, trade in the Midwest. It's because of one man in the White House, Donald Trump, who is simply, in every sense of the word, box office.
Do you think in some respects, if he is to lose, which it's looking quite likely at this point, do you think in some respects you'll miss covering the Trump presidency?
Well, look, it's an open secret that journalists will sorely miss Donald Trump. There was this sort of symbiotic relationship. Trump needed the media, but no less, the media needed Trump. And that is, that's an undeniable fact. CNN's ratings, on week 27 of Joe Biden's presidency is not going to be the same as CNN's ratings on week 27 of the Trump presidency. That's for sure. I mean, Joe Biden is a veteran politician. He's the ultimate establishment figure here. He's been around Washington since the age of 29. He's been a senator since the age of 30. He's been vice president for 8 years. He's 78 years old in a few days' time. So look, this is not a presidency that's necessarily going to grab the world's attention by itself. That's not to say that there won't be important decisions made, and we'll, of course, invest heavily in covering America as a story, but it may be that we're covering less of the White House in the future, in the next 4 years, and covering more kind of the story out in America, particularly maybe looking at stories like racial justice and other issues that do resonate back to a UK television news audience.
Just finally, I wanted to ask if there's maybe anything else that we, the UK public and the UK news consumer, might have missed about the Trump presidency.
Well, I mean, I think, I get a lot of, as do all, I'm sure, Washington reporters get a lot of feedback saying that we're unfair to Trump, that we're too critical of Trump, that we fall into a kind of pro-establishment kind of narrative, and that we've never kind of really understood the Trump phenomenon. I listen to that criticism. I kind of, I know where that's coming from, and it's part of the sort of Brexit debate as well, that, that the elites, broadcast media has misunderstood the mood of a nation, in this case America, but in case of the Brexit debate, has missed the kind of, the surprise that was the Brexit outcome. My overview here is that we've tried exceptionally hard to try and understand, not necessarily Donald Trump, but the Donald Trump voter. I spent a lot of time speaking with Donald Trump supporters. I like many of them, some of my friends, and we try and make sure that we're not taking the Trump phenomenon for granted. And I think it reflected a little bit in the fact that he played so, it was such a strong result, even though he may have lost, almost certainly has lost. Perhaps by the time people are listening to this podcast, he has lost the presidency. Nevertheless, for me, the takeaway of this 2020 election is how incredibly strong he ran, despite being in a pandemic, despite having a kind of an appalling opening debate, despite these endless kind of Twitter provocations. He very nearly won re-election. He won in Florida. He won in Texas. He won, in vast swathes of this country. And that is, I think, my takeaway of this election and how television news covers it is that is not something we should take for granted. We have to understand that, yes, he may have lost the election, but he touched something that was pretty unique in America. He had a relationship with a crowd and with the underserved white working class voter here that is something that I've never seen in American politics before. So I actually feel like I've learned a lot in the last 4 years of the Trump presidency as a journalist, but also as somebody who just lives here. I've understood that, there is a craving in America for kind of an anti-establishment, kind of non-conformist, kind of iconoclastic type of character who doesn't fall into the kind of neat kind of categories of being an elite Washington insider. So yeah, I think that perhaps the surprising thing that people don't realize is that actually we've learned a lot from Donald Trump these last 4 years.
Good stuff. And I wouldn't want to let you go, Robert, without asking you what you've been watching on TV. We are, after all, a TV trade podcast. So has it just been wall-to-wall news stuff, or has anything caught your eye over the past few weeks?
I mean, it's a good question, Max. Recognizing that this is a broadcast podcast. Yeah, it's fair to say, look, I was saying about, the volume of news that comes to us, and information that comes across. So, I'm grazing across all of the television news channels, obviously, from CNN through to MSNBC and the main channels. But, the insight into Donald Trump is best achieved undoubtedly by watching Fox News. Because if you're listening to Fox News, you know that there's another viewer who's listening to Fox News too, namely Donald Trump. So you kind of feel like you're kind of in his kind of headspace. You're in his echo chamber, if you like, if you're listening to Fox News. So that's why I think even, liberal critics of Donald Trump also listen to Fox at the moment, because they know the president's getting his information. It's kind of like being inside the room when he's receiving his kind of presidential daily briefing or something. You know that this is the broadcast consumer of all presidents. No president's ever consumed television like Donald Trump has. In fact, he spent more time probably watching television than all previous presidents put together as the birth of our industry, Max. So yeah, we are aware that television news is not only something that's our medium that we're broadcasting on, but it's something that to a remarkable extent is also informing the president of the United States. We all know, everything about the president's television viewing habit. We know that his favorite program is Fox and Friends, the Fox News morning show. We know that he loves Hannity. We know that he loves Tucker Carlson. We basically, these last 4 years, have grown up bizarrely with Donald Trump's kind of viewing habits. It's fair to say that our viewing habits are kind of a mirror, have been kind of in the footsteps of Trump himself. That's kind of dictated what we watch.
That's so interesting. And again, just another element that is so unique to him, isn't it? Like, I don't think you would ever have applied that to George Bush or Obama or anyone who came before him.
Obama was reading erudite books and was in there in the weeds and the granular details of his briefing papers, and was regarded as the kind of super cool but very intellectual president. I mean, this is a guy who gets Trump is a guy who gets his information from Fox News. He's much more interested in that than hearing from some academic or some think tank. This is the television news presidency. And so to be a television news journalist during the television news presidency, I would say, Max, has been the kind of privilege of my lifetime.
Fascinating stuff, and a really, really good point to end on, Robert. And I'm sure you have an extremely busy day ahead. So thanks so much for joining us.
Always good. I love to talk about politics, but no less about television news, which is the lifeblood of our industry and what we enjoy doing.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcast News Wrap. I'm senior reporter Max Goldbart, and you've been listening to ITV News Washington correspondent Robert Moore. This week's podcast was edited by Jesse Whittock. And for more on the broadcast news industry, you can check out our special Broadcast ITN microsite commemorating ITN's 65th anniversary, where you can find the latest news, competitions and initiatives. That's at www.broadcastnow.co.uk/ITN-65. And as ever, you can check out past episodes of our Newswrap podcast on Spotify and iTunes, or on the website via www.broadcastnow.co.uk.